Welcome to Ampersand, the podcast helping good people be heard and comms people be better. Thanks for joining us today, Jackie. I'm so happy to see you, and I'm very, very excited to hear about your thoughts on these topics. But we start every podcast with an icebreaker question, which we joke very regularly that it's basically to date you. Can you share a memory from your first computer or early days on the internet?
Yes, well, the first computer that I used was to write report cards because I was a classroom teacher, and we didn't have a computer at home. There were computers at the school, but the school that I was working at during the time was 50 miles out of Calgary. So I traveled downtown to my husband's office and worked there late at night to use the computer. And so that was quite the experience, and it was a really big deal when we finally had and bought a computer for our home. And but when I went into the master's program at the University of Saskatchewan, um, yes, I did go into the university to use computers there. And I remember the printers, like they had not separate sheets of paper, but that continuous roll they used to have.
Yeah, where you had to like pull the sides off after it printed. Yep.
Yes, and it was like the dot. Um, I'm not sure what they called
I
it,
think there
but
was a dot matrix, maybe.
exactly a dot matrix for the printer. And then you'd rip out the sides and tear it apart, and there was my paper.
It was
uh,
very labor intensive.
it was labor intensive, and but it was magical at the time, right? And now it's amazing at how technology has advanced over the years, and it's just so rapid. And it's technology is just evolving at such an incredible pace.
Yeah, and some communities are being left behind, which we don't talk about enough, I think. But
It's so true, especially when we think of rural and remote and northern communities and the connectivity or non-connectivity that they have, or sporadic connectivity. So there and it does impact um, the pace of um, educational achievements.
100%. So
Mhm.
switching gears a tiny bit, I wanted to ask you about your memories of the TRC. I didn't know you back then, so I don't know where you were or what you were doing, but I'm curious how, what you remember from the TRC days and how that's shaping the work that you do today.
Yeah, so I was at the University of Calgary when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission gatherings were being done. And actually even before that, when the commissioners were being chosen, I remember being very engaged in learning about who the commissioners were, and the work that they were going to be engaged in, and also the the story behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself, right? And that it emerged as a result of um, the survivors of residential schools and the compensation that the survivors were receiving, and a portion of that compensation went directly towards the establishment of a commission, and 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 just the all of the work that the commission was mandated to engage in. And as I mentioned, part of that was to engage with the community, and and as a result of that, there were 7 gatherings across the country that um, that were identified. And there was a lot of anticipation in communities, and I remember that because for many survivors, it, there were stories that they never shared. stories about their experiences in residential school. And my mush and my grandfather went to residential schools, in two of them actually, one in Gordon's residential school, and then there was Elkhorn in Manitoba. And he came back home. I think he was about 17, is what my dad said. Um, he left when he was about 8. So up until that point, his parents didn't allow him to go, and of course that was basically breaking the law at that particular point. So there were stories that I know that my grandfather just dealt with internally for years. So the national gatherings provided a safe space for survivors and community members to come together, and that was significant. And as I said, I remember the angst and the uh, the opportunity that was generated in community, um, and the safe space included therapists that were there for the survivors and the community members. And uh, my my one auntie was one of those therapists that was there to support people in Saskatoon. And I remember talking to her afterwards, and she said the 3 commissioners, were supported spiritually during that time, because the stories were heavy and heartbreaking. And the people who shared stories during that time were also supported by the therapist and the elders who were there, uh, to be there for them. But the therapist didn't have that support, and so my auntie was sharing her story um, about how she was impacted by um, by those stories, and also um, by the support that she was giving the survivors and community members. And so she had to ensure that she was reaching out um, for for support herself. So it was significant. And as I said, it just impacted our communities in very big ways. And so much grief, um, and it was the beginning of truth telling, and it was cathartic. For some people, it was healing, or the beginning of healing, because once that kind of horror reaches the surface, then there is uh, the question of now what, right? And so truth telling, it can be um, devastating, um, and not easy, but it is the beginning of something, right? And we hope that it is healing. So that was, I just clearly remember that time, and asking myself, or wondering, and hoping that this whole process would lead us to a better place. And so those 7 gatherings, and I recall this, lasted 4 years. I think it was from like 2010 to 2014. And I did follow it along the way. And when the calls to action, the 94 calls to action, were released, that was June of 2015, I was in Ottawa. So I was in the room. And once again, there was the anticipation. There was just a lot of hope in the room, and it was an amazing feeling to be there.
I was there too, and it was I don't even know if I have the words to describe the feelings in that room, and they ranged the whole gamut of feelings. And yeah, it was a very intense and important moment in history, I think. And I just remember being very like, how did I end up here? But I am thankful that I am.
I felt the same way, and I I remember for some people it was just this huge sigh of relief, that here is a gift, 94 calls to action to the community, to our society, to Canada, and basically that's a roadmap for all Canadians to engage in reconciliation and to consider, um, to really to consider how to where individuals and organizations can situate themselves within those calls to action. Um, and the piece that I think we really need to hang on to and to um, continuously remind ourselves about is the story, right? And um, in some cases, we focus on reconciliation and drop the truth telling bit. And we forget that uh, the commission and the calls to action emerged because of residential school survivors.
Um, I mean, one of the most, I think, repeated quotes is around the importance of education. It got us into this mess and it will get us out.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that in mind, you're the president of First Nations University. How do you indigenize the curriculum you're teaching? How did the perspectives sort of play out in the day to day? I know that's a really big question, but are there things that you think other folks should know about?
Yeah, so First Nations University of Canada began as Saskatchewan Indian Federated College in 1976. And so when you consider education getting out of this mess, that process was begun by Indigenous First Nation leaders and elders and visionaries in well before 2015 and the calls to action. Um, and education has been identified as a value, a consistent value for Indigenous peoples. And as far back as the treaties, really, when you consider where First Nations University of Canada resides, and that's in Regina, Saskatoon, Prince Albert, and we do have a traditional campus called Neoskan. Um, so we're on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, and within both of those treaties, education is identified as a value. So that goes as far back as 1876 and 1874. And in some of the research that we've engaged in, we learned that in 1910, there were a group of First Nation leaders that gathered from Saskatchewan and Manitoba to discuss issues that they would bring to Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. That's who they were at that time in 1910, and so in 1911 there were four First Nation leaders that traveled to Ottawa on a one-way ticket by train to meet with INAC, members of INAC, and part of the message that they were at, or part of what they were advocating for, was for First Nation owned and operated higher education institution, and that was in 1911. And we have those photos. So the story of this university began well before it became realized in 1976. And we're almost 50 years old. Next year we'll be 50 years old. So First Nations University of Canada has been working towards um, uplifting Indigenous communities for almost 50 years, right? Well before the calls to action, and a lot of work has been done before the calls to action. So, and that's important to recognize. Are those stories prior to the TRC, um, and so now with First Nations University throughout the existence, Indigenous knowledge systems have always been centered, and it's foundational to the university. Everything we do is guided by Indigenous knowledge systems, from the teaching, the learning, the research, the governance, um, and our relationship with Indigenous communities. It's We're immersed in Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. Our students, we have 9 programs, and within each one of those programs, our students are learning about that particular discipline from an Indigenous and a Western perspective. So they graduate with what you can call a two-eyed seeing approach to their discipline. And they step into every sector of society. So our library also carries primarily Indigenous literature, Indigenous artifacts, microfiches. So we have approximately 60,000 um, pieces of material, and that again is microfiches. It's old newspapers, it's books, it's literature that focuses on Indigenous topics, and that's over our 3 campuses. So our students have access to Indigenous content that many universities don't have. And we do have other universities that look to our collections to support the learning, and so and that's Indigenous literatures and content from North America, Central America, and South America. So it's a very, very unique collection. Um, in all of our spaces, ceremony is ever present. Smudging is an everyday thing for some of our students, faculty, and staff. We have elders that make themselves available to support our students, and so we do embrace our students in very holistic ways. And I would say that that is and has been the success of First Nations University, is that particular approach. Again, that is very much an Indigenous approach. And if you look at kinship structures, our kinship structures, we place students in the center. Our children are at the center of our kinship structures, and so we replicate that for our students at First Nations University of Canada. And Our learning, again, it's many of our faculty really lean into experiential learning, and for our traditional campus, our students are there for cultural learning, language learning. Elders again converge to teach our students about the power of land-based learning, and those experiences they take with themselves um, into the future, into the workforce. So there's tremendous value um, for an institution like this.
Post TRC. We've seen a lot of people moving towards trying to do their piece for the calls to action. And I think there's probably been some missteps along the way. And I'm just wondering what advice you might have for other educational institutions that aren't necessarily Indigenous on how to incorporate the learnings that you have taken and implemented, you know, on indigenizing the institution per se. That's a huge question. Sorry.
It's a huge question, but it is a question that I've been asked frequently, and it's really important for institutions to understand the Indigenous histories, and the contribution of the Indigenous peoples to the development of Canada, and the unique positionality that Indigenous peoples have with Canada. I'm learning that there are people who don't know that Indigenous peoples are mentioned in the 1982 Canadian Constitution, and and that there is a Section 35 that focuses on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So that's a legal, we have a legal stance that um, that really communicates that yes, there's intersectionality with equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, EDIA initiatives, but we are unique within the Canadian landscape, and so there's that kind of learning that is very important to educational leaders and to educators across the country. And within the institutions, again, even though there's more um, Indigenous executives within higher education institutions, and there's a growing number, and there's an increasing number of Indigenous strategies. Um, we have to consider the uh, systemic barriers and what are the systemic barriers within our institutions. In universities, we have university standards, and those standards determine um, merit, promotion, tenure of faculty, among other things. And so the question is, if you open those standards and if you explore those standards, what does it say about indigenous uh, indigenous methodologies, indigenous pedagogies, indigenous service to community? And for a long time, indigenous research methodologies have not been recognized or valued within universities. And so, with our indigenous faculty and researchers, if they are hoping to be recognized in the merit and promotion and tenure processes, um, um, that is challenging. So over time, that has changed, but there's still a long ways to go in relation to perhaps collective bargaining uh, agreements, CBAs, and university standards. So those are foundational documents to universities. And once they recognize the unique ways that Indigenous faculty and researchers engage in these areas of teaching and learning and research, then we're going to see more people, more Indigenous faculty be successful in promotion, tenure, and merit processes. And of course, once you support that, then you're also supporting Indigenous students. You're going to have more role models within the university, and exploring again the barriers. for Indigenous students, and it's interesting that I'm still hearing similar barriers from when I first entered university in the 80s from students today. Right, so there are these persistent practices that um, that lead to some students opting out of universities. Um, so the change has to be sustained over time, and there needs to be resourcing, um, not soft monies, but um, um, sustainable resourcing for some of these changes that are needed that will support our Indigenous students to program completion.
Yeah, because there's things like childcare and like a bursary
Yeah.
or a tuition. Tuition only does so much. You still have to eat and feed, and have
Mhm.
your family taken care of to take time away from work and go back to university or go to school.
Exactly. And there are a lot of students that are on wait lists to go to university, and um, those wait lists are in our First Nation communities. Um, so there's a lot of need, and I think if we come together to talk about um, how to support First Nation uh, and Inuit students, also again, there are those barriers, and Métis students are doing a lot better than First Nation and Inuit students. So, what are those pathways that we're creating um, from high school to university or the trades into the workforce? And we shouldn't have any wait lists within our communities. It does demonstrate the lack of post-secondary funding for our students, and that's a general misconception that uh, First Nation students get post-secondary education for free. So there still is a need to challenge misconceptions and stereotypes because they also act as barriers for our students.
So you were the first Indigenous person, I guess, First Nations person, to become president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. I'm just wondering in what ways you've observed progress from specifically on the TRC's calls to action within educational institutions.
The TRC calls to action was a bit of an awakening for Canada, and I would say it really opened the eyes of individuals and people within organizations about the role that Canada had in um, suppressing Indigenous voice, Indigenous peoples, and creating barriers to universities because Indigenous people couldn't enter university, or First Nation people couldn't enter university without giving up their membership to community. And as a result, there were people, First Nation people, that chose um, not to step into post secondary organizations.
Sorry to interrupt. Up
Mhm.
until what year do you know when that was reversed?
That was the 60s.
Okay.
So it was very very recent, and there are First Nation people that are asking universities to apologize for their role in creating barriers and engaging in that kind of um, racist practice. And so with their TRC and those particular calls to action, those calls to action really do. Again, there's the truth telling part of TRC, and the calls to action are really there create pathways to reconciliation. And so the bit for universities, the calls to action for universities are there as a beginning, right? And like anything, it's really important to consider how we can not only step into those calls to action, but really run with them and consider other ways to engage in reconciliation. Um, and when I was the president of CSSC, I also was in talks with Congress, and Congress is the umbrella for these societies and the association, the academic societies and the association, and so one of the documents that emerged during my presidency had to do on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization, and it was called Igniting Change. And so there was a committee of um, allies and Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars that came together to create this 100+ page document. And again, that was another pathway document. It created it. In it also are examples of what universities can do to demonstrate that they are embracing EDI and decolonization. And at the same time, there was a charter that universities can sign, demonstrating their commitment to EDI and decolonization, and ultimately reconciliation. So there were very interesting and engaging discussions and dialogue that were happening during that time. Um, and um, and so there's universities are at different places and spaces. There are some universities that are just beginning um, deep-seated change processes, and other universities are well along that pathway. So there's strategies that are guiding those processes, and there are hires of Indigenous executive, Indigenous faculty, and there are also um, not only recruitment processes for Indigenous students, but retention. And that's the other bit is, you could bring students in, you can bring Indigenous scholars in, but what are the um, what are the changes made to ensure retention and of Indigenous students over time? And one thing that's been learned is that Indigenous higher education institutions are still doing better in student retention and program completion than mainstream universities.
That doesn't sound surprising to me for some reason, given that, an Indigenous institution is built for an Indigenous person to feel comfortable and at home and learning in the way that they want to learn versus the way that mainstream education is sort of, I mean, it's always struggled. It can't be one size fits all.
Yes, I agree, and we're in this time of what Dr. Gregory Kahede had talked about and encouraged us to do years ago, and that is to think outside the box, live within the circle. So Indigenous philosophies really embrace and encourage that particular concept, and to be adaptive. And universities are very traditional organizations, and and they lean into centuries old tradition. But our world is changing and rapidly changing, so we have to be responsive to that change, right? So and it seems like because of technology, our world is getting smaller and our interconnectivity is more rapid, and it connects us real time to different parts of the world. So universities again have to embrace and be a part of that change. So it'll be interesting to see how we evolve and change over time. And it will require us to think outside the box and live within the circle.
It's like the perfect segue into the question. We're 10 years out. It's obviously
Yeah.
the 10-year anniversary. It is June 2025, so we are 10 years post calls to action release. Where do you think we're going to be in 10 more?
This is another question that I've been asked over time. And when I was thinking of this question, I went back to 2018 PowerPoint. And um, and so that's what I'm going to read for you, if that's okay.
Sure. I was
Okay.
super interesting.
It really is, because I think my answer wouldn't really change from 2018. And actually, I wrote these 8 points. I think it was more like 2016. So it is they're fairly old, but still very relevant. And the first the first thing is that Indigenous peoples, as Canada's first people, will be recognized in all content, ways of being and doing, and accepted. Um, and so I'll read that again. Indigenous peoples, as Canada's first peoples, will be recognized. Um, and our ways of being and knowing and doing will be accepted. The second point is the stories that are told will be vastly different 10 years from now. And within them will be embedded possibility, hope, and strength. Because what we've heard over time is very much a deficit oriented story of Indigenous peoples. And so we're saying that Canadians and our Indigenous youth, our Indigenous communities will be sharing a different narrative. And the third point is Indigenous knowledges will live in programming, curricula, strategies, and practices. So they'll be, all of this will be weaved, and there wouldn't be that advocacy anymore by Indigenous scholars or leaders to have that, to have authentic Indigenous content available for all of our students. Um, and Indigenous leadership will be secured in governance structures. That's happening, but that will be continuously increasing over time. Role models will role models for everyone will be evident and commonplace at all levels. Learning and relationships will be richer because of Indigenous methodologies and pedagogies. And why? Because right now we are still defending ourselves in some spaces, and we're asked, why do we need to do this? Why do we have to have mandatory courses on that focus on Indigenous peoples, our histories, our our literatures, our practices? So why will be replaced with when and now what? Um, and our children will anticipate the university experience and look forward to being agents of change. And so our children are First Nation children, Indigenous children. And our universities will be places transformation and great influence. And for us, First Nation University of Canada will be known as the epicenter of Indigenization, because my definition of Indigenize, or my definition of EDI, um, is or Indigenous indigenization, decolonization, and reconciliation, is that indigenization needs to be led and should be led by Indigenous peoples. Like, who better to know Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and lived experiences than Indigenous peoples? So, indigenization needs to be led by Indigenous peoples. And the way that I see um, our Indigenous um, philosophies and um, our teachings, I see them as healing forces. Because when you consider all of our philosophies, they speak to interconnectedness, right? An example of that is the concept of all my relations, and that speaks to the relationship, interconnectedness of all humanity in our relationship to all creation. And so that's healing, right? And decolonization is more of a challenging force. And that's a collective responsibility. And we are challenging demeaning and divisive policies and legislation and structures, right? So that's a collective responsibility. And both of those, indigenization and decolonization, lead to deeper forms of reconciliation. Again, part of the vision that I hope we're stepping into is that relationality between indigenization and decolonization and reconciliation.
Yeah, and that's the thing that often gets lost, is that it's not just for Indigenous people to reconcile. In fact, they have nothing to reconcile for. It's us and the non-Indigenous folks who are guests here, right? Thank you
Mhm.
so much for that list. I think it's wonderful and super aspirational. I hope we're there in 10 years. That would be amazing.
I hope so too.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Ampersand. Thanks for joining us. For more comms and design tips, sign up for our newsletter at m-agency.ca and follow us on your favorite podcasting app so that you don't miss our next episode. Ampersand is hosted by Meghana Ramaswamy and me, Caitlin Kealey, and it's produced by Elio Peterson. This podcast is a project of M-, the small agency focused on big impact helping progressives be heard.